Welcome to Interdependent Study, our podcast where we engage in the learning and unlearning work for collective liberation. I'm Aaron.
And I'm Damien. Thank you so much for joining us today. Each week, we'll bring something new to the table and discuss our thoughts and feelings about it through the lenses of who we are and where we can go for a more just society.
We want Interdependent Study to be a space where we're always learning with one another. And Damien, you're up this week.
Yes, sir.
What are you bringing to the table today?
Well, I couldn't let you be the only one of us having fun with this and bringing the incredible Eyes on the Prize 3 docuseries to the table. So
I guess.
I decided to get up in the fun and bring the third episode of the series today. The episode that we watched is titled Million Man March. And if it isn't obvious from that title, the episode is all about the conditions and circumstances that led to the Million Man March that took place back in October of 1995 in Washington, D.C., which saw upwards of 1 million people attend, mostly and largely Black people, and specifically Black men and Black boys were in attendance at the march, but there were certainly other folks there as well. So the episode chronicles the planning and the execution of the march, as well as some of the challenges that the planners of the march faced. There was some really great insight into a few of the issues that some Black leaders and Black churches and even folks in the federal government had with the march. And most of that was centered around Minister Louis Farrakhan, who was the one who led the charge for the march and was also sort of seen as its co-leader. And so a lot of those folks had issues with Minister Farrakhan's beliefs and values, but folks also had issues with the focus of the march being only on Black men and only Black men being invited to it. Also with the mission and the goals of the march and just kind of wanting clarity there. And so the episode does a great job in sharing all of that context with us, which I thought was great. The other amazing thing about this episode is that we even got to watch pieces of the march. And so not just the some of the speeches that were given during it, we also got to see folks leaving their homes and leaving their loved ones, traveling to DC, mostly by bus, arriving at the march, taking part in it, kind of reflecting on what it meant to be there, and then sort of leaving and returning home from the march. And what I really appreciated about that was there was this real emphasis on the transformative impact of the march, not just really on the attendees, but way beyond that, right? Like what this would mean for Black men, the Black community moving forward. And so I appreciated that. But yeah, this was another incredible episode in this docuseries and yet another important moment in our history and the fight for justice that was highlighted here. So I was thrilled that we got to watch this, and I'm excited to chat about it. So let's do that. What did you think? Where do you want to start?
Yeah, this was another great episode, as expected.
Yeah.
I think I learned a lot about the Million Man March that I didn't know before, which was powerful. And I think I had only heard bits and pieces of the story overall. Yeah. And obviously, I knew some of the characterizations of Minister Farrakhan as they've been floating around white communities since he's been in the public eye.
Yes.
But I wasn't aware that he called for the march. I didn't. So they said that, and I thought, I knew he was involved some way. That was part of my narrative, but I didn't know he said, I want to bring 1 million Black men to Washington, D.C. I didn't know that's where that started. You mentioned the archival footage, and it's so great.
Yes.
As you again mentioned. Based on what we saw, it looks like we could go and watch almost the whole thing.
Yeah, absolutely.
Online.
Absolutely.
And based on a very cursory YouTube search, I do think that is the case.
Yes.
And so I appreciated some of the background, as you mentioned, too, that was provided in the early parts of the episode, from some of the gang violence that felt very prevalent at the time to the way that the news focused on crime and how crime was almost exclusively depicted as Black people at the time. And you know, that's still a theme today.
Absolutely.
In some aspects. And Newt Gingrich's contract with America and that legislative agenda he was putting into place as Speaker of the House following the 1994 midterm elections and what that meant for the context, and a whole lot of other stuff going on too.
Yes.
And all of that added up, I think, to a very specific moment that gives an understanding of why the march was what it was and why the criticism of the march being limited to men was so extensive. I think there's a broad spectrum of things that were happening to a lot of people. And so I think it felt like, and we'll talk about this in a little bit, I think, but it felt like a disconnect between there's a lot of these things that are happening to all of us.
Right.
And you only want to talk to men, and that feels funny.
Yeah.
But so anyway, I learned a lot about the march, and the documentary does a great job, as to be expected, telling that story, I think, in a really effective way, warts and all.
Right.
Of what happened.
Oh, that's a great way to put it. I think, I was fascinated to listen to Minister Farrakhan speak at these rallies and gatherings. And you're right, there's a clear acknowledgement in some of the archival footage that we saw of the issues facing the Black community at large. But then there was this decision made to focus on Black men. And it was an interesting one. And I think there are a lot of reasons why they did that, and a lot of good that can come of bringing communities together in that kind of a way. But there a lot of what I learned from this was the challenges and the pushback to the Million Man March. And so let's talk about that. The great Dr. Angela Davis is featured in this episode, which is great. She had a lot of concerns about the march. In one press conference, one of the things she said was, quote, "Justice cannot be achieved with a march that excludes Black women and minimizes Black women's oppression." Which is powerful. And then in some interview she did, I think for this episode, she shared this about the work her and her comrades were trying to do to challenge the purpose of the march and to challenge the leaders who were putting it together. She said, quote, "We were challenging the masculinist notion that all one had to do was to secure the future of Black men and the Black community would be safe. I would say that the opposite is true. When Black women are elevated, when non-binary Black people are elevated, then that elevates the entire community. Black women rarely struggle only for themselves. They always bring the family, the community along. And because this was to be such a massive march, we wanted to use it as an opportunity to encourage deeper thought about what it meant to be engaged in the struggle for Black freedom." And I love that. I think her thoughts there and her rationale for the challenge was really spot on. And it was important that the march be challenged in this way by Dr. Davis, and I think someone of her level and caliber for sure. And, part of me, when I was thinking about this, I think we've come a long way collectively in some of our thinking about the importance of inclusivity in our work and our movements and our fight. But I appreciate Dr. Davis for reminding us in this way, in the masterclass way that she did, of how important it is to offer those kinds of insight and pushback and challenges and analysis to the work when it's needed. I also think about how critically important it is to elevate and even center Black women in the fight for liberation. We've talked about this before, and she's 100% correct about that, because I think, and I agree with her, when we achieve liberation for Black women, we will all be free.
Yeah, as we know from reading the Combahee River Collective Statement, if Black women were free, it would mean that we would all be free.
That's right.
And so, yes, agreed. I also want to add a little criticism to the episode. I think it was great. So it's just a little criticism. I think that Dr. Davis is underutilized here.
Yes.
She pops up for a few minutes in the first third of the episode, and then we never see her again.
Yes.
Which is wild to me. I just kept expecting at some point to
pop back up.
To pop back up and talk about something, but just never happened. So she's in this episode for 2 minutes, 3 minutes.
3 tops. Yeah.
Very, very brief. But another moment in the episode that I thought was fascinating was, we talked about the coordination of the event a little bit, and we've talked about admiring how much work it takes to pull something off like this before. When we talked about the March on Washington and Byron Rustin's work to organize that, and obviously other folks were involved.
Right.
But there's this moment they're talking about the sound system that they were putting together being the largest ever put together.
Yep.
The jumbotrons,
the amount of jumbotrons.
Somebody said there were 10 available in the United States, and we had 8.
Right.
At this one event.
Yeah.
Just thinking about that alone, you understand the scale of what they were trying to do. And they were trying to make sure that people could hear and people could see. And so there wouldn't be any kind of push to try to get to the front or get closer to something to be able to see people.
Absolutely.
Wanted to make sure everybody could see from where they were. And I think that's important and a good thing to focus on.
Yes. Absolutely.
And you mentioned they brought buses in from all over the country and then had them park on the outskirts of the city because they realized they couldn't park all those buses inside the city. And then folks took the metro into the city, which wasn't possible in the 60s because it wasn't built yet.
Right.
So it's a nice touch of a shift in using the infrastructure that was now available.
Absolutely.
And then they also heard some rumors about some white supremacist elements in local law enforcement agencies in Virginia and Maryland who were planning on stopping buses due to so-called traffic issues because of morning rush hour, because they were planning to arrive Monday morning.
Yep.
At some
It was a
point.
Monday morning. Yep.
And so they called everybody up after they heard this and told them to arrive between midnight and 4 a.m. so there could be no interference with them, which was brilliant.
And if I recall, I think that's 2 days before the march. Like, it was.
It was change your plans. You have to arrive 4 to 8 hours earlier than you were planning on arriving.
Yeah.
Which is a lot.
Yeah.
And also, they make a point. We did all this without the internet. This was in 1995. Some people had that, but mostly we didn't have that
at all.
And so that's also fascinating to just understand how different some of those elements could be now.
Yes.
Although now we would send an email and nobody would read it, but that's a different story, right?
Absolutely.
So there's a brilliant shift in the plan and a brilliant way to get people into the city without interference from those state police agencies.
Yep.
But I also laughed when Benjamin Chavis, who was the head of the NAACP at the time of the march, said that there were white supremacist elements in some police departments because it sounded like he was breaking some news to us. The tone in his voice, I thought, well, no way. I said that out loud to the TV. I was like, no way.
Yeah.
You mean to tell me what? So I also had to share that moment because I had that chuckle.
I had that thought, but I wonder it was just the way in which he presented it. I was trying to reflect on it, like, because it was so funny.
Yeah.
Like, no way. No, you know what, Sherlock, right? Like, of course there's white supremacist elements within.
Right.
Oh my gosh, the law enforcement in those states, absolutely. But yeah, I was so fascinated by it, just the logistical hurdle that it takes to tell people 2 days before, arrive 8 hours earlier, and it happened.
It happened.
They
figured it out. Yeah.
And so that was really just beautiful to see, and especially again, as I mentioned at the top, like to then watch them all descend off those buses and to get on the metro and to see all of that was just beautiful. One of the other things I wanted to mention that stood out to me, because I think there's so much parallel with our current times, and a lot of it resonated with our current times and our current political situation, and all of that was really the sort of conditions that were at play that led to Minister Farrakhan and others calling for the Million Man March. You know, the folks in this episode talked about how there was so much happening in the early 90s, and I know that some of this we've talked about. There was this powerful convergence of incidents and issues and events that happened that made Black people really angry and fed up and resolute in the fact that there needed to be some change. And so you talked about Newt. You know, there were racial profiling was the flavor of the month. There were huge tax breaks being divvied out to the wealthy. The Clinton crime bill of '94 had just been passed. There was the Rodney King incident, and so. And then one of the other things that they highlighted, which I thought was really great, was the role and the impact of the media and how the media was portraying Black men and Black people in general in the community, both in pop culture, but also in the news in particular, and what they were covering in the news and those news stories.
And Cops, because Cops was so huge at the time, and there was a couple of clips from that show in the documentary. That just highlighted
that was a big show. Absolutely,
at that part of the narrative there.
Absolutely. So, you know, all of that was at play and was the impetus for that, but it just reminded me of like everything that we're experiencing right now. The onslaught of executive orders and circuit court appeals and military actions and Supreme Court decisions and that horrific One Beautiful bill that just passed and prior to 2025. And just the fact that I feel like every hour I get a bunch of push notifications about breaking news and it's all just too much. And so, you know, like with the impetus for the Million Man March, it just makes me wonder, when's the moment? Like, what's going to happen? When are we all going to collectively break and resist the empire and resist everything that's happening in our present day? I mean, I think the conditions are certainly there, right? Yeah.
And I think there's been a lot of moments along the way.
Yes.
Right? I think about post Trayvon's murder.
Yes.
And then in 2014, after a few folks were killed by police, and then 2020. So there's been a lot of moments along the way. And so I wonder what the next one will be.
Yes.
Because I think all of those moments have created in different ways foundations
Yes.
for people to continue to build.
Absolutely.
And I think that that's whatever's next, I think is going to be more organized, I think more connected, more collaborative maybe.
Yeah.
I think more people know what they're doing
Yes.
than maybe 12, 13 years ago.
Absolutely. That's a great point.
So, yeah, just interesting to think about that as well. And yeah, I definitely thought about that law, the big ugly wealth transfer, when they were talking about
Yes.
the 90s and the way that the crime bill and Gingrich's agenda was impacting people.
Yes.
Because it feels like we're just ratcheting that nonsense up even more. Tax cuts for the wealthy at the expense of kids and seniors' medical insurance, or billions more for ICE and deportations at the expense of SNAP.
Yeah.
It's just more of the same nonsense 30 years later.
Yeah.
And one of the other moments that I wanted to highlight was Maya Angelou. So shifting gears totally here.
Yes.
But Maya Angelou, because she wrote a poem for the occasion and it was amazing and moving. So one of the stanzas goes, "The night has been long, the wound has been deep, the pit has been dark, and the walls have been steep." And that's so poignant and perfectly said.
Yes.
And one of the people who's interviewed for the documentary series says that he has remembered that particular stanza from when he attended as a young person. And it has stuck with him as something moving and something to hold on to.
Yeah.
And so I wanted to just share that a little
Beautiful.
bit because I think it's so powerful.
Yeah. And poignant and powerful for the time, and still remains
Yep.
poignant and powerful given where we are. All right. Well, if you bring up Maya Angelou, that to me feels like a great time to shift our conversation here to
Still we rise.
Still to the application portion of our show. So how does this episode and our conversation about it apply to our everyday lives and work? My application is connected to part of what Minister Farrakhan said at the march in his address to the crowd about the evil in America. And so this is only part of what he said. He said, quote, "The real evil in America is not white flesh or black flesh. The real evil in America is the idea that undergirds the setup of the Western world. And that idea is called white supremacy." And he goes on to talk about how white supremacy doesn't allow white people to live and grow into their full potential, and how it invites them to see themselves as the law or even above the law. And I think all of that is obviously really spot on. There have been countless examples of the dangerous and damaging impact of white supremacy throughout history, and that unfortunately is still true in our present day. We can see the impact of white supremacy in particular in the plans for part of 2025 and the far right's efforts in our government right now. And so the application of the importance of understanding and naming and eradicating white supremacy is huge and a major takeaway from this episode for me.
Yeah, absolutely. And the power in people coming together
Yes.
to do that. And when Minister Farrakhan said that about white supremacy, I was nodding.
Yeah.
Like, yep. I wasn't sure where he was going to go because, again, there's so much criticism baked into who he is as a person and how he has presented himself and some of the things he said. And some of the criticism seemed real valid.
Absolutely.
And so I think as I was listening to him, I was also listening with that critical lens of like, what are you about to say? I've got no idea. And so I really thought so much of what he said that was shown in the episode was real spot on and felt still relevant to today. And, the other thing I wanted to bring to application is something that was said at almost the very end of the episode. So Roderick Terry, who's a lawyer, said, quote, "The Million Man March was a spiritual awakening of the highest order." And so I wonder what that could look like in a more regular setting.
Yeah.
And I think in a more routine way, like not a giant march, not anything elaborate, but what does it look like in the everyday?
Yeah.
And I think the obvious answer for some people is church.
Yeah,
But
sure.
I think that this is more than a service.
Yes.
It's there's something else here that is different. And so what does it look like to encourage all of us to turn toward one another in smaller ways in our communities? Because I think that's one of the key takeaways
Yeah, I love
from the march. For me, as I saw it, it wasn't about anybody's particular religious ideologies. Even as Minister Farrakhan was speaking, you could hear, I think, hints of it as he was talking of what his beliefs are. But it really was more about turn to your brother.
Yes.
And what do you do? Like, what can you do for one another?
Absolutely.
And I think that there's power in turning to community and seeing one another in that way versus church service sometimes feels like I'm in community and we're here to serve this higher power,
purpose. Yes.
whoever that might be in terms of my beliefs. And this is how do we serve one another? And so I think that's a different thing than just going to church.
Absolutely.
So I wonder what that looks like on a more, regular basis. In a smaller way than just bringing another 1 million+ people to the Mall of Washington, D.C.
Absolutely. No, the ending of that and the work he did to ask folks to turn to one another and to hold hands and to say, I love you, brother, and I'm here for you, and to talk about the things that they were going to do once they left. I thought there was real power in that, and it's connected to what you talked about, that idea of community and how important that is. And so I love that application. Very good. All right, well, let's talk about homework. How do we want to continue our learning and unlearning work once we wrap up this episode about this episode? So first of all, I think we've got a few more episodes of this docuseries that we need to finish. We're this far and we've got to keep going. So hopefully we can do that before the end of the year. So that's one piece of homework. I also, like you, want to revisit the story of Louis Farrakhan a little bit more. Realize that there's, I think, a lot that I know about him, but maybe some that I think I know, or, I just want to do some education around Louis Farrakhan and his story and his beliefs and his vision and all of that, just out of curiosity, mainly. What about you?
Yeah, I think that's good. Even if it's just scratching the surface, like a Wikipedia entry or something, that I think that's going to challenge some of the narratives that are out there about him. Absolutely. We need to keep watching this. I think we're halfway through now.
Yes.
So I would definitely hit your goal of watching this by the end of the year.
Great.
I also want to go and watch Maya Angelou's reading of her whole poem because the whole thing's not in this episode. But I'm sure that we can find it online. This whole thing was broadcast on C-SPAN, it looks like. So I think we can find clips of it. But I want to find it and listen to it because it's easy for me to forget how much poetry and art make a difference in our world, particularly in the face of fascism and white supremacy and all of the systems that we're living through. And so it's something that I try to remind myself of as much as possible. And this seems like a really great reminder of why and how art is powerful.
Absolutely. I mean, just that small passage you shared right there is enough for me to say, put it on the screen over there when we're done. All right, folks. Well, that's our conversation about the third episode of the Eyes on the Prize 3 docuseries. You should definitely check it out. Aaron, you're up next time, my friend. What are you bringing to the table in our next episode?
I'm bringing Witches, Witch Hunting, and Women by Sylvia Federici, which is our book for July.
Okay.
And it's published by PM Press in 2018 and focuses on the increasing violence against women that's happening globally and how that's connected to a variety of things like accumulation of wealth and globalization, and also how this violence is tied to witch hunting in Europe in the 16th and 17th centuries. There's also some exploration of things like sort of common concepts now that are tied to femininity that she pulls back the curtains on what the roots of those concepts are, which I think will be a fascinating conversation for next week.
Yeah, no, I love that piece. I also just love the connections in this to, what's happening with other systems and the way in which the world is set up. That's been some of the most fascinating pieces of this book for me too. So I'm excited to chat about it with you next time. Let's do it.
Yes.
All right, well, with that, we want to thank you for joining us today. You know what we want you to do here, but in case you forgot, please follow, leave a rating and review, share our podcast with the people in your life, follow us on social media, including Instagram, TikTok, and Blue Sky. Check us out on YouTube and sign up and join us on Patreon to get notified about any new things we've got going on behind the scenes.
Yes, thank you for listening. And remember, it's not about us, but it is about all of us. And we'll talk to you next week.